So last week we focused on the big picture, but specifically the Gospels and the life of Jesus and the work of Jesus. Now we're on to Acts. Now, Acts is a shortened form of a traditional title, which is called the Acts of the what? Of the Apostles. That's not the original title of the book. That's just a traditional title. The book itself doesn't give a title, but I would submit that the Acts of the Apostle is a poor title. And I'm not alone in that. Many scholars think it's a poor title. And here's why. Here's how the book starts. In my former book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and teach until the day he was taken up to heaven. So what is he talking about? That's how Acts starts. In my former book. What does that mean? Right. He wrote another book, and that was the book of Luke. Here's how Luke starts out. Luke 1. This is the second half of 3 and verse 4. I too decided to write an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. So, not only is the style between Luke and Acts very similar, people who study the style of the way it was written in Greek, they say looks like this was written by the same person, but both books are written to this person, Theophilus, whoever that is. No one knows who that is. There's a lot of different theories. The most prominent theory is that he was the patron who said, Luke, you actually sailed with Paul. You were in this whole thing from the beginning. Can you write down an account for me? And the purpose for this 2-volume work, really it's one work in 2 volumes. The purpose for this 2-volume work of Luke Acts is what? What does he say? Right there in verse 4. Luke 1:4. I wrote this so that yeah. So this is primarily written to Christians for certainty. Of course, it has evangelistic purposes also. Okay, so it's written by Luke to Theophilus, and obviously it's very clear that it's written to more than just him. It's written for a wide audience. But then he goes on to say, the beginning of Acts, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and teach until the day he was taken up to heaven, after giving instructions through the Holy Spirit to the apostles he had chosen. So this is how Acts starts out. But notice what he says about in Luke. In Luke, in my former book, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and teach. So what might the book of Acts be about? Anyone want to? The rest of the story. What Jesus continues to do. So this is really a continuation. But notice the way he says Jesus did things in his first book. After he gave instructions through the Holy Spirit. So even during his lifetime, everything Jesus was doing, he was doing through the Holy Spirit. He was doing his miracles. He had laid aside his own divine powers, and he was doing his miracles through the power of the Holy Spirit. The way any Christian could if they were as close to God as Jesus was. So that's why, when Satan tempted him, turn this stone into bread, that's why he shouldn't do that. It was a temptation because he could, but he shouldn't because he had laid aside for his earthly life his divine powers. And so what he was doing was through the power of the Holy Spirit. And of course, God the Father and the Holy Spirit, right after that temptation was over, did provide for him in their own way through angels. But the point is, the dominant character in this book, the one who's doing things, is the Holy Spirit. All throughout this book, it's all about the Holy Spirit. Now, you could say the acts of Jesus through the Holy Spirit or something like that if you wanted. But it's clearly the dominant theme and the dominant character. The term Holy Spirit in all four Gospels put together, if you were to read all four and circle Holy Spirit every time you saw it, there would be 26 times it was used in the four Gospels. In the book of Acts, it's used 41 times. Almost twice as all the Gospels put together. So, clearly it's a major theme. It's a bigger theme in Acts than it is in any of the Gospels, or all of the Gospels. Any questions about that? Also, as we'll see later, the main characters keep changing in the book of Acts. Which apostle is the main apostle? It switches over the course of the book. Which you never have that, do you? Anyone ever read a novel where you have like a main character, the protagonist, and then halfway through it kind of forgets about him and goes to somebody else? I've read a lot of books. I've never read one like that. But this one does. Because the apostles are not the main characters. The Holy Spirit is the main character, and Jesus. At one point in the book it says, then it's talking about the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, the Spirit. Then it says the Spirit of Jesus did such and such. So that's the main character of the book. Okay, so now the question is, why did Luke write Acts? What is the purpose of Acts? Well, here is a sort of a diagram of what the world was like. There was a whole lot of cultures, and there was the political power of the Romans and the Greek culture and philosophy and the Jewish culture and their religious things. And then the church comes on the scene in the midst of these huge competitors. Now, that is a really messy chart. It's more accurate, but it would be really hard if I were to start listing things in red under Romans in those circles, and it would get all crazy looking. So I've sort of neatened it out. This is easier to understand, but it's going to be a little bit less accurate because it was all a big milieu, a big mess of things going on together. But anyway, so there's the Romans, Roman people, Greek people, and Jewish people. And as you know, does anyone want to take a guess as to what the Romans and Greeks have in common?
They're not Jews.
They're not, yes, that's true. That is a good one. They are Gentiles, but they are both pagans. They did have different languages, but they had very similar religions. They were both pagans. And what set the Jews apart, aside from some cultural things, was that they were monotheists. And Judaism was actually very attractive to many Romans and Greeks. And there were proselytes, converts to Judaism, because monotheism was attractive. And not only that, but the Jews were the people of God. Now, the Athenians, people from Athens, may have thought they were the people of Athena, but their view of the gods was very capricious and I'll bless you today and tomorrow I might sink your ship, so good luck. So knowing that they were the people of God, that was attractive. And of course the Jews were very arrogant about being the people of God. Also, they had the Old Testament scriptures. These are to us. This is a covenant by God himself to us. You have these eternal promises. So that was an attractive thing. With the Greeks, one of the things they had was philosophy, which was a big deal to them, and aside from religion. And one of the things the Romans had, aside from religion, was their power, their military and political power. The Romans had that. And then on the scene comes Christianity in the midst of all this. And the majority of the Jews rejected Christianity. They said, No, we don't want that. We're going that. Now, there was a small remnant of Jews who did accept Christianity. The majority rejected it. So that small remnant, I say small, it was thousands and thousands of people. But compared to the millions who rejected it, it was small. So, Christianity came on the scene, and Judaism rejected it, the majority of the Jews. And Christianity came around and was growing, and they said, you know what? Judaism is wrong. By and large, they rejected their Messiah. They're wrong. And they're not the people of God. Actually, we are the people of God. Because they rejected their own God. And those Old Testament scriptures, those actually relate to us. They're about our God that we actually believe in. They didn't accept their own God. So this, what you have here, this is the key concept to the book of Acts. The church in the midst of these major competitors. And of course, this chart is sort of organized. It was all jumbled together in real life. You were meeting people that were part this and half that, and they were Jews, but they only spoke Greek and all kinds of different things. But this is the simplified version. And this is the key concept. It's kind of a tricky concept. Do you have any questions about this? I know not everyone likes charts and graphs, but does this make sense? Because this is key. We're going to keep explaining it in different ways and adding to it, but if you have a question now, you should ask it. Okay. All right. Okay, so Christianity not only said Judaism is wrong because they rejected their own God, but the pagan religion, they're wrong. And the Greek philosophy, it's wrong. We're not afraid of Greek philosophy. We're not like, oh, the Greeks are so educated, we can't compete with that. You have examples of Paul debating top thinkers and philosophers on Mars Hill. And a lot of Greeks converted to Christianity when they heard the gospel. And the Christianity came along, not only did they say that the Greeks were wrong about what they thought about the world and their worldview, and the Jews were wrong in their religious view, they also came along and said, we're not afraid of Roman power either. We're not a threat. Hey, come on in, Dean. That's okay. They said, we're not a threat to Roman political power or military power. We're not trying to take over anything politically, but we're not afraid of it. And it's not even real power. The true power is through the power of the Holy Spirit, which the book of Acts demonstrates again and again and again. So, let me get you one of these. And many Romans came to convert to Christianity also. So, in words here, the church is the true people of God. And the true fulfillment of the Old Testament. So, there are some questions then, if that's the case. People in Luke's day, probably Theophilus was one of them, and lots of people had these questions then. How can this be true? How can the church be the true people of God and the true fulfillment of the Old Testament? How can that be true in light of these facts? The first two are, the Jews are God's chosen people. And most Jews reject Jesus in the church. So God's chosen people say that's not the way of God. So how can the church say they're the chosen people? That was a big question at Luke's time and one of the purposes for writing this book. There's a couple more questions they have. How can that be true if the church is becoming predominantly Gentile? That was one of the hot button issues of the day in the church. Today there's all kinds of hot button issues, as you know, right? Depending on which church you're in, there's a different one, whether it's homosexuality in one church, or it's should we sing hymns or modern song, or can we have a drum set in the church? Wherever you go, there's a different hot button issue. But this was one of the big issues. The church seems to be becoming predominantly Gentile, so how can we say we're the fulfillment of the Old Testament? How can we say we're the true people of God? We're not even the people. We're not even God's chosen people. And then, of course, the Old Testament writings, those are Jewish scriptures. How can we say they apply or they relate to Christians? Yes?
Clarify something for me. Maybe I was falling asleep when you refer here to the church, which is?
Christianity.
Okay.
Every single Christian in the world is the universal church. And of course, in each city, there's local churches. But the church, the bride of Christ, call that the universal church.
Okay.
Thank you. I should have made mention of that sooner. Thank you for bringing that up. So, all those questions about that can be answered partially through Acts chapter 7, Stephen's speech and his martyrdom, and that is included on the last 2 pages of your notes. Okay, let's start at this end of the room. Did anyone find any themes of rejection in verses 9 and 10? Yes.
Joseph was rejected by his brothers.
Yeah, Joseph was rejected by his brothers, but then he ended up saving their lives, and God was with him. Okay, good. What about any examples of rejection in 23 through 27? Anybody look at those verses?
Moses rejected the Egyptians.
Okay, good. What else?
His own people, the Israelites, rejected him.
Yeah. What? Yeah. What did they say to him?
Who made you king?
Yeah. Who made you a ruler over us? You're going to judge us? Well, Moses was the first judge, and for the next 400 years of judges. But okay. What about 35 and 36? Still on the theme of Moses. Anyone look at those verses? Find anything?
Again, who made you ruler?
Yeah. The same Moses they had rejected with those words. What did he do? What does it say about him?
He brought them out of Egypt.
Yeah. He was the same one they rejected was sent by God himself. So there's always this contrast between what God is doing and what the people are doing. And this chapter 7 is a long chapter. It's a long chapter, but it's all important stuff to show. I mean, you wonder, why does Luke include this speech when it's basically a summary of the whole Old Testament? Well, because Luke is showing that how the Old Testament, everything God was doing was being rejected by the Jews. So that's why it feels like God's going in a different direction now. He's not, and we'll get to that, but it's all all interconnected. Okay, did anyone do 38 through 41 and find anything? Any themes of rejection?
They were,
Our ancestors refused to obey him, they rejected him, and their hearts turned back to Egypt.
Yeah. They're just slaves in Egypt and their hearts turned back to Egypt.
they were worshiping idols.
They were worshiping idols, yeah. They're the only people in the world whose God is real and not just a piece of stone or metal. And they prefer the stone and metal gods. They can't do anything. Okay, anyone do 42 and 43 and find any themes of rejection there? We may have covered that. I think we just did, sorry. Okay, what about 51 and 52? This is one of the big ones.
They resisted the Holy Spirit.
They resisted the Holy Spirit. Good. So resist, I mean, that's not the word reject, but if you resist someone, you're not going along with them, you're not accepting them. What else? There's another...
Was there ever a prophet your ancestors did not persecute?
Was there ever a prophet your ancestors did not persecute? Meaning every time God sent you someone, you persecuted them. And then when God came himself, you killed him.
Jacob, it's a wonder God is still working in the lives of Israel.
Back in verse 42, just to go back, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
It says God turned away from them and gave them over to the worship of the sun, moon, and stars. God rejected their worship.
Right, yeah. And I think there's big major themes of the exile there. Yeah, that's right.
Just had to say it.
Yeah, eventually God says, okay, fine, you want to worship idols? Go ahead. Worship your idols. I'll send you to the idol capital of the world, Babylon. Okay, so everybody God sent to you, you persecuted, and then even those who predicted the coming of the righteous one, and now you have betrayed and murdered him. You received the law that was given through angels, but you have not obeyed it. Okay, and then there's one last one that's not on this list, but it says in verse 55, but Stephen, full of the Holy Spirit, looked up to heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing in the right hand of God. Look, he said, I see heaven open and the Son of Man standing in the right hand of God. At this they did what? Covered their ears and screamed at the top of their lungs. They did not want to hear the truth. They were furious. And they murdered him as a group. So Stephen becomes the first martyr. So, we've gone through these, each one, and all of them are full of Israel's rejection of their own God. So, we get back to this question. How can the church be the true people of God? Not that the church is now Israel, but how can the church be the true people of God and the fulfillment of the Old Testament when you look at those facts? Well, it's because the majority of the Jews rejected their own prophets, they rejected their own God, and finally they rejected their own Messiah. So, this answers the question. Most Jews reject Jesus in the church. That doesn't show that the church is wrong. That's one of the points Luke is making. The fact that most Jews reject it doesn't show that it was wrong. It shows that they're wrong, and they had a history of being wrong. Now, of course, there was a remnant. There were always, all throughout biblical history, the Old Testament, there was always a remnant who did stay faithful to their God. And that's true with the switch into the New Testament era, the New Covenant. Okay, so here's another diagram. This is how we tend to think of it. Like here's Judaism, and then Christianity is an offshoot of Judaism. Christianity took a different road. Isn't that the way people tend to think of it? But that's actually not true. Here's what's true, is that God is working with his people, and there's an old covenant and a new covenant, and the new covenant is predicted in the old covenant. It's all part of the plan. But when the new covenant comes, this should have been the culmination of Judaism. When that comes, the majority of the Jews, they turn away and they say, this is true Judaism, this is the right way. They look at it the way the previous slide had it. But that's not true. This was God's plan. That's why so much about Jesus and the church was predicted in the Old Covenant. Does that make sense?
Repeat it.
Okay, so it looks like to a lot of people, like this is the way it is, that Judaism is a religion, and then at one point, this little group broke away from Judaism and became Christianity. That's the way probably in secular textbooks they might explain it. But that's actually not what happened. This is what happened. God was working with his people. His chosen people were Israel. Of course, it was always open. All throughout the whole Testament, it's always open. And if there's a stranger who joins you, they can be part of it. You know, Isaiah, let not the foreigner say, I'm cut off from God's people. Foreigners are welcome into this covenant community. But not many of them were. Like, an example is Uriah the Hittite, one of David's mighty men. He's not Jewish, but he was part of it. Okay, so this was the plan. God was working with his people, and it was all building to this new covenant when their Messiah would come. It was predicted the whole way. But when it gets there, which should have been the culmination of Judaism, most of the Jews reject it and say, no, that's some other sect. We're the true Jews. Instead of sticking to their own religion and worshiping their own God, when he actually comes to them in flesh and they can see him, they reject him.
And still to this day, my Jewish friends say that those who believe in Jesus are not true Jews.
Right, yes. And there are still Jews who believe in Jesus. We call them Messianic Jews. Right. Yes.
It really is sort of amazing, Jacob, that all through the Old Testament you see the Jews not only rejecting God and the prophets, but making their own idols to worship. And here, as we move into the new covenant, they did exactly the same thing. They were presented with the Messiah who would save them, that was been talked about through all of the Old Testament, and yet again rejected the true God.
Yeah. Yes. I was trying to listen so I could repeat it all on the microphone. Yeah, it was predicted the whole time, but then when it came, they rejected it. And one side note is make sure you don't ever think, oh, those Jews, they got it wrong. That's not the point of the Old Testament for us. The point is to show us a picture of what our hearts are, constantly making our own idols. We maybe don't physically bow down to them, but we worship other things in another way by the amount of time we think about them, right? If you love your car and you're thinking about, I'm going to have to wax it this weekend, and that can become an idol in your heart. And so it's a picture of how the human heart constantly turns away. And without God changing our hearts, we'll always turn away from him.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes?
How do the two sets of Jews, okay, you have the Jews and the Messianic Jews, do they worship together, or how does that
No,
work?
they don't. Some people who are Jewish by blood just assimilate into Christian and American culture, but there are Messianic Jewish synagogues temples, whatever they call it. I've been to some. But Jesus, everything about Jesus is very offensive to Orthodox Jews.
Jacob, I have a Jewish lawyer, and he said there are liberal Jews, conservative Jews, and Orthodox Jews. And he said that he was a conservative Jew.
Mm-hmm.
And he said he couldn't go to the synagogue in the villages because the rabbi there is gay. So he won't go to that one. So he goes to the conservative. So then I started telling him about Jesus.
Yeah, well,
And he listened.
that's true. There's three major sects of Judaism: the liberal, the conservative, and the Orthodox. The liberal ones are very liberal. I was talking to a rabbi who said, "Oh, we're coming out with new English Tanakhs," which is what they would call the Old Testament, and they change it to, like, every time it says God is our Father, it says God is our Father and Mother, things like that. Updating it. And it's the same thing in Christianity. But anyway, we can't get off on that. Okay, so this is another way of explaining this chart, right? That only a remnant accepted their Messiah. Now, any questions about this? Okay, so that answers the question of people had. They're like, how can we be the people of God if most Jews reject it? We don't have any connection with Judaism because they think we're wrong. They think Jesus was wrong. Okay, so that answers that. Now, the next key concept is the church. So the church is the true people of God in the fulfillment. Acts is all about the church and the growth of the church. And it is unstoppable. That is presented again and again and again, right? Peter is arrested and imprisoned, and what happens? There's an earthquake, and he just walks out. An angel just brings him out. Again and again and again, the church, in the book of Acts, the church is facing incredible odds and always wins. Church is unstoppable. The growth and spreading of the gospel is unstoppable. Why? Because God, the Holy Spirit, orchestrates everything for the growth of the church. The persecution of Stephen seemed like a setback. All kinds of things like that. Everything that seems like a setback is all orchestrated for the growth of the church because God's behind it. And there's several times when it says, Gamaliel, if Jesus was nothing, it'll come to nothing. But if he's from God, then you're going to find yourself fighting against God. And that becomes prophetic for the rest of the book. If you're fighting against it, you're going to be fighting against God and you won't win.
Jacob, would you go back to this?
Yes, just one second. I just want to say also with Paul, it's hard for you to kick against the pricks, right? Mm-hmm. The goads. Paul's kicking against iron spikes. He's not going to win. No matter how hard you kick, it's just going to hurt yourself more. And that theme comes up all over the place in Acts. Yes, now.
The majority of Jews rejected
their own prophets. Sorry, let me go back. There it is. Their own prophets, their own God, and finally their own Messiah. Okay, and then this question, the church is becoming predominantly Gentile. What do we do about that? How do we handle that? Is that bad? Does that mean we're doing this wrong? The church is the true fulfillment of the Old Testament. So let's look at this key verse in Acts chapter 1, verse 8. I'm going to lay it out here a little differently. I just spaced it out this way. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you. So this is Acts chapter 1. Jesus is telling them what to do. You're going to be my witnesses. You'll receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you. You will be my witnesses. That's a key theme. It's not really about you apostles. You're just witnessing about me. Be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. Now, for those of you who are not super familiar with the geography, I've provided this nice little map here. And there's Jerusalem. So that's where it's going to start. You're going to be my witnesses there. And in the region which Jerusalem is in, Judea, and in Samaria, a neighboring region, and to the ends of the earth. So it would be like saying, if Jesus came here and said, you're going to be my witnesses in Lady Lake, and in all of Lake County, and in Marion County, and everywhere. Right? City, region, neighboring region, ends of the earth. And that becomes sort of a rough outline for the book of Luke that he puts there. Luke puts it there, the book of Acts. Luke puts it right here in chapter 1 of Acts to become an outline for the book of Acts. And there we have the ends of the earth. And Jerusalem's there, and it spreads. So, here's our outline of Acts. It's printed there for you, but the first 6 chapters all happens in Jerusalem. It's primarily about Jerusalem. And then there's the stoning of Stephen, which seems like it should be a setback. Because, oh no, the Jews might kill us if we think Jesus is the Messiah. You tend to think that would be a setback, right? Like if our governing authorities started just killing you if you were a Christian, you think, well, that's really going to hurt the church. But look what it says. Not only is it just Stephen, in Acts 1:8, would anyone like to read that for me?
But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit...
No, sorry.
1:8?
I said 1:8, I meant 8:1. I'm a little bit dyslexic, sorry.
Oh, right. 8:1 says, and Saul was there giving approval to his death. On that day, a great persecution broke out against the church at Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria.
So starting with Stephen, a great persecution broke out. And all Christians, not counting the apostles, were scattered. That is really unfortunate for church. They were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. I'm sure God was very upset about that. That wasn't part of his plan, was it? It was exactly what Jesus said. You're going to be my witnesses here, and they kept staying there, and so God scattered them throughout Judea and Samaria. And then we see, it's following this structure, we see that it's unstoppable because God's behind it. But following that structure laid out in 1:8, those locations, chapter 8 then is about Samaria. And so the first half of chapter 8 is about the ministry to Samaria, and they are partially ethnic Jews and partially religious Jews, Samaritans. We talked about that last year. And so they can get saved, and they have sorcery and all kinds of things, but they can get saved. And so they're like, oh wow, it's not just for Jews, these Samaritans. They're kind of half Jewish by race and by religion. And they can get saved too and get the Holy Spirit. That's great. And then Philip talks to this Ethiopian who by race is completely Gentile, but by religion is Jewish. So he's kind of, in a different way, half Jewish. Not by blood, but by religion. He's a proselyte. He's Jewish by religion. And he can get saved. That's the second half of 8. And then you have Saul's conversion, which is, we'll come back to later in chapter 9. And then in chapter 10, big turning point here. Up until now, Peter has been, up through chapter 10, Peter has been the main character here. And you have Peter going to Cornelius. And Cornelius is a Roman centurion. So he's completely Gentile by race and by religion, but he lives there in Israel, in Caesarea, which is on the coast. And Peter, is a big deal. God shows him this vision that you can go, and then orchestrates a whole lot of things. And Peter goes there and he's like, I guess God, the Holy Spirit's leading me here. At first he doesn't want to, but God gets him there, And then Cornelius gets saved and he sees the Holy Spirit poured out and he's like, wow. So that's a big change now. A completely Jewish person who lives there in Israel, a completely Gentile person who lives there in Israel is getting saved. And it's so shocking to the Jewish Christians that Peter has to have a big, long explanation. And he's like, I didn't know they could get saved either, but I went there and I saw the Holy Spirit poured out. So he goes, and they're like, wow, even Gentiles can get saved. We thought this was just, the culmination of Judaism, but it's not. It's more than that. So you see that progression of Jerusalem, Judea. You see it happening here. And then, of course, in chapter 11, big shift to Antioch, and they have to do an explanation there too. They think, okay, well, maybe he could get saved, Cornelius, even though he's completely Gentile, but he was living here. And then up in Antioch, which is way outside of Israel, up north, people are getting saved, and the Holy Spirit's getting poured out, and they're like, I guess this has no bounds. And that's where Paul joins the thing. So then there's chapter 12 is about Peter escaping prison, which we'll talk about that structure in a moment, why that's right there. But Peter escapes prison, and that's the last bit of Peter being the main character. From then on, from chapter 13, starts the whole thing about Paul's missionary journeys. And that becomes the major theme and structure for the rest of the book, is Paul's journeys. And then Paul becomes the main character. And Peter predominantly drops out of the story. So you can kind of see somewhat of a structure. It's up through chapter 12. Really up through 11, it's all about Peter, but there's this little chapter about Saul, or Paul, his other name, inserted there. And then once the shift, right there between the explanation and Antioch is the shift where Paul becomes the main character. It starts, but there's this little chapter about Peter stuck in there. So you see the transition happens. For a while it's about both of them, and then it goes totally to being about Paul. The point is, it's the Holy Spirit. It's not them. So these missionary journeys start here in Antioch. You can see it's north of Jerusalem, way outside the country. And I'm not going to get into all the details about the journeys, but I've given you a very, very rough arrows for the journeys. So see if you notice anything about these journeys. Watch the screen and how the arrows. Here's the first journey. Here's the second journey. Here's the third journey. And then his final journey. Now let me do that again, see if you notice a pattern. First journey, second journey, third journey, final journey. You notice anything? Any kind of progression there? It's just like what the writer laid out in verse 8 of the first chapter. Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, the ends of the earth. And his journeys keep getting bigger and bigger. Now, if you go through the lists of all the cities he hit, you see, each time he's hitting new cities and new cities and new cities. And then it ends with Paul in Rome. Does that correlate to the little structure Luke gave in 1:8? The ends of the earth? How could Rome seems like the center of the earth, not the ends of the earth. Is there any correlation there?
Its influence goes to the end of the
Yeah, it's the heart of the whole empire. So symbolically, that's, in their minds, Rome is the whole world, the Roman Empire. There were apostles who'd gone outside the empire, but that's not really the point here of this structure, is to show that it's just unstoppable, and the Holy Spirit is guiding all of this. There's lots of times where Paul I'm going to go to this city, and the Holy Spirit's like, no, you're not. You're going over here. I have a plan. I'm behind all of this. Now that we're on to Rome, there is another smaller theme in Acts, which is played out with Paul has many trials before the Roman authorities. The book ends in Rome was the last bit of that. Paul has many trials before Roman authorities, and they always find him innocent. So that's important for the readers of this, the original readers of this book, because they're living in the Roman Empire, and the Romans starting to go, whoa, Christianity is getting big. Some of the emperors are persecuting them. Nero famously, and other ones. Some would, some wouldn't, because Christianity was just taking over religiously. But Roman authorities, he didn't do anything wrong, really. He just upset some Jewish people about some Jewish carpenter, I don't know. And it's kind of reminiscent of Jesus and Pilate, some of these trial scenes, showing that what happened to Jesus is happening to the apostles, and it's growing. So the point here is that Christianity is no political threat to Rome. That was something important for readers of that day to see. Christianity, one of the purposes of this book was to show Christianity is not some weird, new, dangerous religion. It fulfills God's promises from long ago, and it brings blessings. You can imagine if you lived in a pagan world and you knew every city has their own major god, and then different families, well, that's our major god, but we worship this god. That's the god we keep in the home, but sometimes we go to temple. And once in a while we'll go to Zeus's temple, but Athena is our main god, or, whatever. And that was just the way it was. That seemed normal to you. And here's this religion that says, they're not saying, well, your God's not as powerful as our God. They're saying, your God's not real. My God actually is your God. You're just rejecting him. It's like a whole different shift. This is some weird religion. The people, they do different things. It seems like sometimes they get together and drink blood. I don't know. I heard something about that, right? Communion. These Christians seem strange. And so part of the purpose of this book is to say, it's not some new, weird, dangerous religion. It's the original religion. It's the original God from the start of the world. And it brings only good things. And one last little note, unlike Roman citizenship, which is briefly touched on here and there, it's freely offered to all. It's not like you have to be born into it or you have to earn your way into it. Remember that little conversation between Paul and one of the authorities? He's like, I'm a Roman citizen. He's like, whoa, I had to pay a ton of money to become a Roman citizen. Paul says, well, I was born into it. It's not like that. It's freely offered to all. So, to sum up, the last page. Acts is all about the Holy Spirit and Jesus working through the Holy Spirit. And of course, God the Father. And it's all about the growth of the church in the midst of huge competitors. One of the biggest ones in the book, and the biggest ones that were messing with the church, is Judaism. And Acts shows that the church is the true people of God to whom the Old Testament relates. This is because Judaism as a whole rejected God's way for them. And the church grows from a tiny Jewish sect to a worldwide, multi-ethnic spiritual kingdom. And it is unstoppable because God is the one spreading it. Another one of the competitors, which is one of the major themes in Acts, not the major theme, it's a lesser theme, but it's still there throughout, is that relating to Rome as one of the huge competitors. The church is no threat to Rome, and the church actually makes good citizens. Eventually the church does does take over Rome, but not through political means. So, any questions about the whole book of Acts or anything we covered?
I always thought Luke was a disciple, but he was not a disciple. Right?
That's right. There's a specific spot where Luke is saying, and then Paul did this and with his companions, and then he did this, and then he stopped in this port, and then we did this. So you can see the precise point at which Luke joins the team and starts traveling around on the ship with Paul to different places. Yeah, he wasn't, but he was a companion of Paul, and so all the New Testament books are written by either the apostles or people related to the apostles, not related family-wise, but just related, connected to the apostles in some way.
I'm just thinking about Rome, and I was thinking that not being a threat, except for the religion, they worshiped their pagan gods.
Yeah.
Christianity, no.
Yes. But Rome was okay with taking over people and had their own gods and letting them have their own gods. They were pretty tolerant religious-wise. They just didn't want anybody to be a military threat.
Okay.
Didn't Rome just treat him like a kind of an offshoot of Judaism?
Didn't what?
It was just an offshoot of Judaism.
What was?
The sect of Jew is how they originally treated it.
Yeah, that's, yes. And they had some Jews do some military revolts. And so, that might have been why they were a little wary of Christianity. They saw them as Jews at first, but as it grew and became its own entity, they began to see there was a difference. Any other questions?
I just want to say that it truly is amazing to me as you look at this history and this overview. And what the people wanted was not what God wanted. And even though the people thought it was wrong, the Lord made it work out to his plan. Even in the midst, everybody didn't understand, everybody was confused, and it just really reminds me so much of what we're living with today. There is a plan, and we are part of that plan.
Yeah, and you see clearly through the story, you see God's plan at work, and you can see why it would seem like, whoa, God's really messing things up here. Like with Paul ending up in Rome as a prisoner, you're like, Paul's the best missionary we ever had, and he has to stay in jail. But a lot of the New Testament was written while Paul was a prisoner in Rome. And he took Christianity to the heart of the empire and had a huge influence while he was a prisoner there. A lot of his companions were like, no, Paul, don't do that. You're going to go sent to Rome, and it's going to be a big... And God had a plan for all of that and used it.